She could light up a room with nothing but a glance. In Lenny, she bared not just her body, but her soul, shattering Hollywood's glass walls of censorship. In Superman, she became the face millions adored, the sly sparkle behind Lex Luthor's schemes. Valerie Perrine wasn't just acting, she was daring the world to watch her, to see her as she truly was. But fame is a fragile currency. Hollywood applauded her bravery, then quietly turned its back. As roles dried up, so did the phone calls. The woman who once graced magazine covers now faced a cruel, invisible enemy, Parkinson's disease, fighting tremors in silence while the industry that once celebrated her pretended she no longer existed. This is the untold story of Valerie Perrine, the woman who gave everything to the camera, and learned too late that the camera never gives back. Valerie Perrine didn't walk into Hollywood through the gilded gates of elite drama schools or Broadway stages. She came from somewhere entirely different, places of neon lights, high heels, and sequins. Born in 1943 in Galveston, Texas, the daughter of a U.S. Army officer and a homemaker, she spent much of her youth on the move, following her father's postings. Her earliest stage wasn't a theater at all, it was the cabaret floors of Las Vegas, where she worked as a showgirl, mastering the art of commanding both the spotlight and an audience's gaze. When she finally arrived in Hollywood in the early 1970s, she brought with her a presence that felt different, dangerously different. She wasn't the porcelain ingenue studios were so used to polishing and parading. Valerie was a grown woman, sultry and self-assured, with a husky voice and eyes that seemed to dare anyone to underestimate her. Reporters labeled her the woman who dared, a nickname she wore like a crown. Her breakout role came as Honey Bruce in Lenny, 1974, Bob Fosse's gritty biopic of controversial comedian Lenny Bruce. On screen, Valerie wasn't simply playing a wife caught in her husband's spiral of self-destruction, she embodied a raw, unapologetic sexuality and vulnerability that few actresses of the time would even attempt. The nude scenes she performed weren't the carefully lit, soft-focus illusions Hollywood used to sanitize the female body. They were honest, unvarnished, and provocatively real, so much so that they sparked debate across the industry. With a perfect blend of humor and allure, Valerie made Eve unforgettable. Her name was splashed across glossy spreads, her smile radiated from late-night talk shows, and her presence was inescapable on the Hollywood circuit. To the public, Valerie Perrine was more than just another actress. She was the embodiment of a new kind of female star, one who didn't ask permission to be bold, who could turn on the charm without surrendering her wit. She spoke openly about the industry's double standards, particularly how it treated aging women. She joked candidly about the absurdities of show business. But there was always a steeliness behind the humor, a quiet refusal to be reduced to just a pretty face. In those years, she seemed untouchable, a woman who had carved her own space in a world that rarely made room for women like her. But the truth was more complicated. Hollywood's affection is conditional, and its memory is short. Behind the scenes, Valerie was already fighting to hold her ground. The same fearlessness that made her magnetic also made her dangerous to a system built on compliance. By the early 1980s, the cracks in her Hollywood armor would begin to show, though the public wouldn't see it yet. On the outside, she was still the glamorous Eve Teschmacher. Still the Oscar-nominated trailblazer. But just beyond the camera's frame, a far more fragile reality was waiting to step into focus. Long before the glitz of red carpets and the flashbulbs of Cannes, Valerie Perrine's life was shaped by restlessness and instability. As the daughter of a U.S. Army officer, her childhood was a constant shuffle from one base to another, Texas, Japan, Germany, each move forcing her to become the new girl again. It was a life of temporary friends, foreign landscapes, and learning quickly how to adapt or vanish into the background. This ability to reinvent herself on a dime would later serve her well in Hollywood, but it came from a place of necessity, not choice. Valerie's early years were far from the protected, carefully groomed upbringings of many starlets. There was discipline in her household, sometimes too much. Her father's military precision left little room for sentimentality, and her mother, while loving in her own way, often felt overwhelmed by the constant moves and the demands of raising a spirited daughter. Valerie learned young that if she wanted attention, she'd have to command it. As a teenager, she didn't fit the mold of the well-behaved officer's daughter. She was sharp-tongued, curious, and eager to push boundaries. She skipped classes, tested limits, and refused to let authority, be it military or social, dictate who she should be. There were whispers about her rebellious streak, about the wild nights in places a young woman shouldn't be. By her late teens, she had left behind the predictability of family life altogether, striking out on her own to find work that would pay for independence. She found it under the dazzling, dangerous lights of Las Vegas. As a showgirl, Valerie was plunged into a world that was equal parts glamour and grit. On stage, she shimmered in sequined costumes, feathers brushing the air. But Las Vegas was more than a job. It was an education in power, how beauty could be currency, how charm could disarm, and how quickly both could be spent. The role of the showgirl taught her how to perform not just for an audience, but for life itself. Every smile, every turn of the head, every calculated pause was a lesson in control. Yet it was also a mask, one that grew heavier the longer she wore it. It was during these years that Valerie began to understand the double-edged sword of being noticed. She knew the thrill of having all eyes on her, but she also knew the vulnerability it brought. Men with promises, some genuine, many not, drifted into her life, offering a ticket out of the desert. One of those promises was Hollywood, a place that seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. When she finally made the move west, it wasn't on the wings of an agent's discovery or a studio's grand invitation. She arrived in Los Angeles with little more than the showgirl's toolkit, confidence, timing, and an unshakable belief that she could make people look, and keep looking. What the public would later see as her natural magnetism was, in truth, the result of years spent turning survival into an art form. But deep down, Valerie carried the weight of those early years, the instability, the constant need to adapt. The fear that the ground could shift beneath her at any moment. Hollywood might have been a new stage, but the rules felt hauntingly familiar. Just like the military bases and the Vegas showrooms. It was a world where you had to keep moving, keep smiling, and never let them see you fall. Valerie Perrine didn't stumble into her breakthrough, she engineered it. By the time she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1970s, she had already learned one of the industry's cruelest truths. The role of Honey Bruce in Lenny, 1974, didn't just happen to her, it was the result of a deliberate transformation. To land it, Valerie stripped away the polished glamour of her showgirl image and embraced a raw, unfiltered realism. She studied the life of Honey Bruce, absorbing her mannerisms, her voice, her unapologetic sensuality. On set, she didn't act as though she was playing Honey, she inhabited her. This metamorphosis was so convincing that even seasoned industry insiders began to see Valerie not as an ex-showgirl chasing fame, but as a serious actress with something to say. The acclaim from Lenny was a double-edged sword. It opened doors, but it also labeled her as the daring one, the actress who would go further, risk more, show more than anyone else. Valerie understood the value of this reputation, even as she recognized its trap. She began carefully choosing roles that would feed the legend without typecasting her into oblivion. That balance wasn't easy to maintain. Her leap into blockbuster territory with Superman was a masterstroke of reinvention. Gone was the gritty, stripped-down realism of Lenny. In its place was the sly, glamorous Eve Teschmacher, a character who could charm her way past kryptonite itself. The role showcased her comedic timing and gave her a broader audience, embedding her image into pop culture. For a while, she managed the rare Hollywood trick of being both an awards contender and a fan favorite. But reinvention came at a cost. The Valerie that the public adored, the fearless, unshakable woman in control, wasn't the whole truth. Behind the scenes, she was working tirelessly to keep up appearances. In an industry obsessed with youth, she faced a ticking clock from the moment she turned 30. She refined her image again and again, adopting new styles, altering her public persona to match the shifting tastes of the era. Each reinvention required energy, discipline, and an iron will to survive the constant scrutiny. By the time she reached her 40s, Valerie had played the game longer than most. She'd survived the gossip columns, the fickle shifts in studio politics. Valerie Perrine never stopped trying to control her own narrative. Whether in interviews, public appearances, or the rare roles she accepted, she projected the same defiant spirit that had carried her from military bases to Vegas stages to Academy Award night. It was the ultimate act of survival, playing a part even when the cameras weren't rolling, determined to remain, if not at the center of Hollywood's gaze, at least in its memory. The late 1970s and early 1980s were Valerie Perrine's golden years, a time when her name was a guaranteed conversation starter in Hollywood. Lenny had proven she could stand alongside the most respected dramatic actors of her generation, and Superman had catapulted her into the realm of international stardom. She was invited to the kind of parties where the champagne never stopped flowing and the guest list read like the credits of an Oscar ceremony. Directors courted her, photographers sought her out, and magazine editors knew that a Perrine cover would sell. On set, Valerie was magnetic. She had an instinct for reading the mood of a scene, knowing exactly when to hold back and when to explode with emotion. Colleagues spoke of her professionalism, but also of her unpredictability. She was never content to simply hit her marks. And that same edge made her unforgettable in the public eye. Yet behind the glamour and applause, the first shadows were creeping in. The industry's appetite for risk was fickle, and the very boldness that had made Valerie famous began to be treated as a liability. Younger actresses, willing to push boundaries for a fraction of her salary, started filling the roles she once would have been offered without audition. Hollywood's obsession with youth meant that, even before she turned 40, whispers circulated about her age in casting rooms. The irony was bitter. Valerie had fought her way into the industry by proving she was more than just a beautiful face, and now that same industry reduced her worth to the expiration date it stamped on all its leading ladies. The offers grew fewer, the budget smaller. She found herself taking parts in lesser-known films and television projects, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was silence. Financial pressures began to mount. Unlike the carefully managed fortunes of today's A-list stars, Valerie's earnings had been spent freely during her peak years. She had lived in the moment, investing in experiences rather than in the kind of safety nets that could cushion a downturn. When the calls slowed, so did the income, and Hollywood was not a place where past glory paid the bills. The psychological toll was harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Valerie, once celebrated as fearless, began to retreat from the public eye. The woman who had laughed her way through interviews and charmed audiences with her wit now found herself dodging questions about her career. She avoided industry events, not wanting to endure the pitying glances or the awkward conversations that came when people didn't quite know what to say to a star they remembered but no longer saw on screen. It was during this period of dwindling visibility that her health began to betray her. Subtle tremors in her hands and stiffness in her movements were early signs of Parkinson's disease, symptoms she initially kept private, even from close friends. In an industry that judged actors on every physical detail, Valerie knew that revealing her diagnosis too soon could mean the end of any remaining opportunities. She chose silence, enduring the gradual progression of the disease alone. By the time her condition became public knowledge years later, she was already living in near seclusion. The red carpets, the magazine spreads, The long days on set, they belonged to another lifetime. What remained was a quieter existence, shadowed by illness and the unspoken knowledge that Hollywood had long since moved on. The price of her peak wasn't just the career she lost, it was the illusion that talent and courage could outlast the system. Valerie Perrine had played the game better than most, but in the end, the house always wins. By the time Valerie Perrine spoke openly about her Parkinson's diagnosis, the Hollywood that had once celebrated her no longer existed. The roles were gone, the phone calls rare. And the industry's memory of her brilliance had faded into a few nostalgic clips on late-night retrospectives. Yet for those who remembered, Valerie was more than a footnote, she was a trailblazer who refused to conform, even when conformity might have extended her career. Her final years in the public eye were marked not by performances, but by quiet resilience. She lived modestly, relying on the kindness of friends and a small circle of devoted admirers. In interviews, when she gave them, she spoke without bitterness. She was proof that a performance could be both seductive and devastatingly human, and that the truth, when spoken through art, can shake the walls of the most guarded industry. In the end,